Long before the words "Remember the Alamo" ever echoed across a battlefield, long before the cannons roared and the walls crumbled and the bodies of men were burned in pyres under a cold Texas February sky, there was a land. It was a vast, ancient, complicated land that belonged to people who had lived there for thousands of years, fought over it, loved it, built civilizations upon it, and died defending it. The story of the Alamo does not begin in 1836. It does not begin with James Bowie's knife or Davy Crockett's coonskin cap or William Barrett Travis drawing a line in the dirt with his sword. It begins centuries earlier in the swirling, violent, beautiful, and deeply human collision of civilizations that would ultimately produce the conditions for one of the most famous last stands in American history. The land that would become Texas was home to dozens of indigenous nations long before any European ever set foot on North American soil. The Caddo Confederacies lived in sophisticated agricultural societies in the eastern woodlands, building ceremonial mounds and maintaining complex trade networks that stretched across the continent. The Karankawa people inhabited the Gulf Coast, known for their tall stature, their tattooed bodies, and their fierce resistance to outsiders. The Tonkawa ranged across the Central Plains. The Wichita cultivated the river valleys. And perhaps most significantly for understanding the political dynamics of the Alamo era, the Comanche had transformed themselves in the 17th and 18th centuries from a marginal mountain people into the most powerful military force on the southern plains, an empire in every meaningful sense of the word that historians have only recently begun to recognize with its proper scope and significance. The Comanche Empire, or Comancheria as historians call it, stretched across a vast swath of the southern plains and fundamentally shaped everything that happened in Texas during the period leading up to and following the Battle of the Alamo. Understanding the Comanche is not a sidebar to the Alamo story. It is central to it because the presence of the Comanche nation shaped Spanish colonial policy, Mexican settlement strategy, and the decisions of Anglo-American colonists in ways that directly contributed to the conditions of 1836. Historian Pekka Hamnalainen, in his landmark 2008 work The Comanche Empire, documented how the Comanche were not simply raiders or obstacles to settlement, but a sophisticated imperial power that extracted tribute from Spanish colonies, controlled trade routes, and maintained diplomatic relationships across thousands of miles. They were, in short, a superpower, and any honest account of why the Alamo happened must reckon with their role in the larger story. The Spanish arrived in what they called Tejas in the late 17th century, not primarily out of a desire to colonize the land or profit from its resources, but largely as a defensive strategy against French encroachment from the Louisiana Territory to the east. The establishment of missions and presidios across Texas was driven by imperial competition between European powers, and the native peoples of the region were caught in the middle of these competing ambitions. The missions, including the one that would eventually become the Alamo, were built as instruments of religious conversion and Spanish imperial control, serving simultaneously as churches, fortresses, agricultural operations, and sites of enormous suffering for the indigenous peoples who were brought within their walls. The Mission San Antonio de Valero, which history knows as the Alamo, was founded in 1718 near a cluster of springs along the San Antonio River. It was one of several missions established in the region, and for much of its early history it served its intended purpose as a religious and agricultural compound where Franciscan friars worked to convert indigenous people to Catholicism and incorporate them into the Spanish colonial system. The mission's indigenous residents, drawn primarily from various coastal and plains peoples, worked the fields, tended the livestock, built the walls, and carved the stone decorations that can still be seen today. They also died in enormous numbers from European diseases to which they had no immunity, from the violence of raids by Comanche and Apache warriors who saw the mission system as a threat to their power, and from the grinding hardships of mission life itself. The building that everyone now pictures when they think of the Alamo, that iconic facade with its distinctive curved top and ornamental stonework, was not completed during the mission period. In fact, the famous facade was not finished until decades after the mission itself had been secularized. The chapel that served as the last refuge for the Alamo's defenders in 1836 was a roofless ruin at the time of the battle. The building that people most associate with the Alamo was, during the actual battle, without its iconic top, which was added by the United States Army in 1850 when they used the structure as a quartermaster depot. This is just one of many physical details about the Alamo that complicate the popular mythology surrounding it. But to understand those complications fully, we need to understand the larger political and social forces that brought hundreds of men to that ruined mission compound on a cold February morning in 1836. Spain's relationship with Texas was always complicated, always expensive, and always threatened from multiple directions. The Comanche raided Spanish settlements with near impunity through much of the 18th century, killing settlers, stealing horses and cattle, and preventing the kind of dense agricultural colonization that Spain needed to make Texas economically viable. The French threat from the east complicated Spanish military strategy, and the enormous distances involved. Texas was hundreds of miles from the nearest centers of Spanish colonial power in Mexico, made governance and defense enormously difficult. By the late 18th century, Spanish Texas was populated primarily by missions, presidios, a few struggling civilian settlements, and the indigenous peoples who navigated these competing colonial powers with varying degrees of success and suffering. San Antonio de Bexa, the town that grew up around the missions and the military garrison, was the most significant Spanish settlement in Texas, but it remained a relatively small and vulnerable outpost in a vast and contested landscape. The Spanish made various attempts to increase the population of Texas through immigration schemes, but these efforts largely failed to produce the kind of robust settler population that the region would have needed to be genuinely defensible. The Bourbon reforms of the 18th century brought significant changes to Spanish colonial administration, including a reorganization of the military and the reassessment of the mission system. By the 1790s, the missions along the San Antonio River, including Mission San Antonio de Valero, were in decline. Their indigenous populations had been decimated by disease and violence, and the survivors had in many cases drifted back to their traditional ways of life or integrated into the broader mestizo population of the region. In 1793, Mission San Antonio de Valero was officially secularized, its lands distributed among the remaining indigenous residents, and its religious functions transferred to the parish church. The former mission then spent several decades in a kind of institutional limbo, used for various purposes by Spanish colonial authorities. In 1803, a company of soldiers from the town of San Jose Santiago de Alamo to Paris, a town in what is now the Mexican state of Coahuila, was stationed at the former mission. These soldiers, known as the Second Flying Company of San Carlos de Paris, gave the old mission its famous nickname. The word Alamo means cottonwood tree in Spanish, and it referred to the cottonwood grove that grew near the soldiers' home garrison. From this point forward, the old Mission San Antonio de Valero became known simply as the Alamo. The Alamo that the soldiers occupied was already a partially ruined complex. The chapel's roof had collapsed decades earlier, and various buildings within the compound were in different states of decay and repair. The soldiers who occupied it made various modifications for military use, reinforcing walls, adding earthworks, and converting religious spaces into barracks and supply rooms. These modifications would continue under subsequent occupiers, including the Texian forces who prepared the compound for its last battle in 1836. Understanding the physical reality of the Alamo, as distinct from its mythological image, is essential to understanding what the battle was actually like and what the defenders were actually fighting from. When Mexico achieved its independence from Spain in 1821, after a long and brutal war, the new nation inherited all of Spain's territorial claims and all of Spain's territorial problems. Texas was among the most problematic of these inheritances. It was vast, sparsely populated, constantly threatened by Comanche raiders, and increasingly coveted by the United States, which had been casting acquisitive eyes toward Texas and other Spanish territories for decades. The United States had, in fact, attempted to claim parts of Texas as part of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, though Spain rejected these claims, and the boundary between American and Spanish territory had been definitively settled, at least on paper, by the Adams-on-East Treaty of 1819. The young Mexican government, wrestling with the enormous challenges of establishing stable institutions in a country that had been devastated by a decade of revolutionary warfare, recognized that Texas was both a liability and an asset. It was a liability because Mexico lacked the military resources to defend it effectively against Comanche raiders and potential American encroachment. It was an asset because it was potentially enormously productive agricultural land if only it could be settled and developed. The solution that Mexican officials hit upon was both logical and ultimately catastrophic. They would invite Anglo-American settlers to colonize Texas, using land grants as an incentive to attract the kind of industrious agricultural population that could develop the territory and provide a buffer against both Comanche raids and American territorial ambitions. This colonization program, which had actually been initiated by Spanish authorities in the final years of the colonial period, was formalized and expanded by the Mexican government through a series of colonization laws passed in the early 1820s. Empresario grants, as they were called, gave contractors the right to bring settlers into specific areas of Texas in exchange for guarantees that the settlers would be Catholic, would become Mexican citizens, would obey Mexican laws, and would contribute to the defense and development of the territory. The most significant of these empresario grants was issued to Moses Austin in 1820, and after Moses Austin's death in 1821, the grant was transferred to his son, Stephen F. Austin, who would become the dominant figure in Anglo-American Texas until the Revolution overshadowed him. Stephen F. Austin is one of the most complex and often misrepresented figures in the Alamo story. The popular mythology of the Texas Revolution tends to treat Austin as a secondary character, a bureaucrat and diplomat whose cautious, legalistic approach to Texas's problems was eventually superseded by the more dramatic figures of the Revolutionary period. In reality, Austin was the architect of Anglo-American Texas in a much more fundamental sense than any of the Alamo's defenders. It was Austin who negotiated the original colonization agreement with Mexican authorities, who established the first Anglo-American settlements in Texas, who navigated the complex political currents of Mexican politics through the 1820s, who managed relations with both the Mexican government and the indigenous peoples of the region, and who, for most of his career, worked to maintain Texas as a functioning part of the Mexican Republic, rather than to achieve independence or annexation by the United States. Austin's vision for Texas was essentially that of a loyal, prosperous Mexican state populated by Anglo-American settlers who had genuinely integrated into Mexican society and institutions. He learned Spanish, cultivated relationships with Mexican political figures, worked to ensure that settlers in his colony complied with Mexican law, and spent enormous amounts of his own time and money traveling to Mexico City to resolve disputes and maintain the political conditions that allowed Anglo-American colonization to continue. He was, in many ways, genuinely committed to the project of making Anglo-American Texans into Mexicans, even as the Anglo-American settlers he was attracting brought with them cultural values, economic practices, and racial attitudes that made genuine integration deeply problematic. The problem of slavery is central to understanding the contradictions of Austin's project and the larger story of the Texas Revolution. Mexico had abolished slavery in 1829, though this abolition had been preceded by considerable legal ambiguity and was followed by various exemptions and workarounds that allowed Anglo-American slaveholders in Texas to maintain their enslaved workforce through mechanisms like long-term labor contracts that were slavery in everything but name. The slavery question was not incidental to the Texas Revolution. For many of the Anglo-American settlers in Texas, particularly those who had come from the slaveholding states of the American South and who had built their economic operations around enslaved labor, the protection of slavery was a fundamental motivation for seeking independence from Mexico. This is a truth that the traditional Alamo mythology works very hard to obscure. The popular narrative of the Alamo frames the revolution as a struggle for liberty and self-determination against the tyranny of Santa Anna's centralist government. And there are certainly elements of truth in this framing. the Mexican government's political evolution during the 1830s, including Santa Anna's dismantling of the federal constitution of 1824 and his increasingly authoritarian approach to governance, did generate genuine grievances among Texians, both Anglo-American and Tejano. But to tell the story of the Alamo without acknowledging the central role of slavery in motivating the revolution is to tell a story that is fundamentally incomplete and in important ways dishonest. The decade between Mexican independence in 1821 and the outbreak of the Texas Revolution in 1835 was characterized by escalating tensions between the Anglo-American colonists and the Mexican government, tensions that arose from a complex mixture of cultural differences, political conflicts, economic interests, and racial attitudes. These tensions did not make the revolution inevitable, and there were multiple points along the way where different choices by different actors might have led to different outcomes. But understanding how the tensions built is essential to understanding why the Alamo happened when it did, and why it happened the way it did. One of the earliest and most significant conflicts arose over the question of governance and legal institutions. Anglo-American settlers, coming from a culture with strong traditions of local self-government, common law and elected representative institutions, frequently clashed with a Mexican legal and administrative system that operated according to very different principles. The Mexican system, based on Spanish civil law and characterized by centralized administrative authority, was not simply inferior to the Anglo-American system, it was different in ways that reflected different historical traditions and different assumptions about the relationship between individual citizens and the state. But the Anglo-American settlers generally experienced these differences as forms of oppression rather than as legitimate cultural variations, and their complaints about the Mexican legal system were tinged with racial condescension that presumed Anglo-American institutional forms to be inherently superior to Mexican ones. The question of customs duties and trade regulations generated particular friction. The Mexican government, struggling to generate revenue for a financially strapped state, imposed customs duties on goods entering Texas from the United States. Anglo-American settlers, many of whom were deeply integrated into American commercial networks and who relied heavily on imported American goods, resisted these duties strenuously, engaging in widespread smuggling and treating the customs laws as illegitimate impositions. The Mexican government's attempts to enforce its customs regulations, including the establishment of the customs house at Anahuac, repeatedly produced violent confrontations that escalated tensions and moved the two sides closer to open conflict. The political convulsions within Mexico itself also played a significant role in shaping events in Texas. Mexico during the 1820s and 1830s was a country wrestling with fundamental questions about what kind of nation it wanted to be. The conflict between Federalists, who favored a decentralized system that gave significant autonomy to the states, and Centralists, who wanted a strong national government, played out repeatedly in Mexican politics through coups, counter-coups, and constitutional revisions. Texas and the other frontier states of northern Mexico generally supported the Federalist position, which would have given them greater local autonomy, lower taxes, and more control over their own affairs. When Antonio López de Santa Anna, who had initially presented himself as a Federalist, shifted to the centralist position in the early 1830s and began dismantling the federal constitutional framework, he alienated not only Anglo-American Texans, but also many Mexican Federalists, both in Texas and elsewhere in the country. Antonio López de Santa Anna is another figure whose complexity gets flattened in the popular mythology of the Alamo. In the standard narrative, Santa Anna appears simply as the villain, a cruel and arrogant dictator who ordered the massacre of the Alamo's defenders, and whose megalomania brought about his own defeat at San Jacinto. There is truth in this portrait, but it misses the larger context that made Santa Anna such a significant and divisive figure. Santa Anna was a genuine product of the chaos of Mexican political life in the post-independence period. A military officer who had fought against the Spanish, supported the empire of Agustin de Iturbide, helped overthrow Iturbide, and then navigated Mexico's turbulent political waters through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and a genuine personal magnetism that repeatedly allowed him to regain power even after significant defeats. He was also genuinely committed to Mexican sovereignty and deeply offended by what he perceived as Anglo-American contempt for Mexican authority. Santa Anna's decision to personally lead the army that would suppress the Texas Rebellion in 1836 was driven by a complex mixture of motivations: military pride, political calculation, genuine outrage at what he perceived as treason and foreign interference, and perhaps an underestimation of the difficulty of the campaign and the determination of the Texian forces. He approached the Texas campaign as a punitive expedition against traitors and foreign invaders, which shaped the brutal terms he imposed at the Alamo and at Goliad, where he ordered the execution of hundreds of Texian prisoners of war in what would become one of the most consequential atrocities in American military history. The years immediately preceding the revolution also saw significant changes in the demographics and social dynamics of Texas. The Anglo-American population had grown rapidly through the 1820s and early 1830s, and by the time tensions reached the breaking point, Anglo-Americans significantly outnumbered the Tejano population. This demographic shift had significant cultural and political consequences. The earlier period of Austin's colony, when Anglo-American settlers were a small minority in Texas who needed Mexican goodwill to maintain their land grants and their legal status, had imposed certain constraints on Anglo-American behavior and required at least surface compliance with Mexican law and institutions. As Anglo-Americans became the dominant population group, these constraints weakened, and Anglo-American cultural confidence and political assertiveness grew correspondingly. This demographic shift also complicated the relationships between Anglo-American settlers and the Tejano community, the Mexican origin population that had lived in Texas through the colonial period and the years of Mexican independence. The Tejanos were not a monolithic community with a single political position. Some Tejano leaders, like one Seguin of San Antonio, became enthusiastic supporters of the Texas Revolution and fought alongside Anglo-American settlers against Santa Anna's army. Others remained loyal to the Mexican government. Many occupied uncertain positions in the middle, trying to navigate between the competing demands of two communities and two governments. The role of Tejanos in the Alamo story is one of the most consistently underplayed aspects of the traditional narrative, and restoring it to its proper place is one of the most important contributions that recent historical scholarship has made to our understanding of what really happened. The year 1835 was a year of escalating confrontations that made war between the Mexican government and the Texian settlers increasingly inevitable. The process was not linear, and it was not driven by any single grievance or decision, but by a series of incidents that inflamed passions on both sides, destroyed trust, and foreclosed the possibility of negotiated settlement. Understanding this process of escalation is essential to understanding why the Alamo happened when it did, and why it produced the passionate intensity that it did on both sides. The year began with simmering tensions over Santa Anna's centralist political moves, which had alarmed both Anglo-American Texans and Federalist Mexicans throughout the country. In Zacatecas, the most significant and wealthiest of Mexico's states, the state militia had actually taken up arms against Santa Anna's forces in defense of the federal constitution in early 1835, and Santa Anna had personally led the army that crushed this rebellion, sacking the city of Zacatecas and allowing his troops to loot and commit atrocities against the civilian population. The message was clear. Santa Anna was prepared to use overwhelming force against anyone who challenged his authority, and the traditional rights of the states under the federal constitution of 1824 were no longer going to be respected. The news of Zacatecas reached Texas in the spring and summer of 1835, generating alarm among both Anglo-American settlers and Tejano Federalists. The Mexican government's decision that same year to send additional troops to Texas, to enforce customs regulations, and to suppress what Mexican authorities saw as growing secessionist sentiment further inflamed tensions. One of the key incidents that summer was the confrontation at Anahuac in June. when a group of Anglo-American settlers under William Barrett Travis, who would later become one of the Alamo's commanders, attacked a small Mexican military garrison at the customs house and forced it to surrender. This action was actually controversial among Anglo-Americans in Texas at the time, with many moderate settlers condemning it as reckless provocation. But it illustrated how far the more radical faction of Anglo-American Texans was willing to go, and how difficult it was becoming to maintain peaceful coexistence. The Mexican government's response to the growing tensions in Texas was shaped by its own political dynamics and its memories of what had happened in other parts of the empire when settler populations were allowed to grow too powerful. Santa Anna and his government saw the Anglo-American settlers in Texas as a growing threat to Mexican sovereignty, a population that had been given generous terms for settlement and had responded by flouting Mexican law, refusing to pay customs duties, smuggling goods, ignoring the requirement to convert to Catholicism, and maintaining an institution, slavery, that Mexico had abolished. From the Mexican government's perspective, the actions of the more radical Anglo-American Texans were not legitimate political protests, but treason and foreign interference, and they needed to be suppressed with military force. The decision to reinforce the military garrison in Texas and to place military commanders in charge of civil governance in certain areas was a significant escalation that the Anglo-American settlers experienced as martial law. Stephen F. Austin, who had spent years advocating for a peaceful, negotiated approach to Texas's problems within the framework of Mexican law, had spent much of 1833 and 1834 in Mexican prisons after being arrested on suspicion of supporting Texian separatism. His imprisonment, which most historians believe was unjust and politically motivated, transformed one of the most significant voices for moderation and accommodation in Anglo-American Texas into a man who no longer believed that Texas's interests could be protected within the Mexican system. When Austin returned to Texas in the summer of 1835, his shift toward the revolutionary position gave that position a credibility and legitimacy that it had previously lacked. The formal outbreak of hostilities is traditionally dated to October 2nd, 1835, when Anglo-American settlers at the small town of Gonzales refused to surrender a small cannon that had been loaned to the settlement by Mexican authorities for defense against Comanche raids. When a Mexican cavalry force arrived to retrieve the cannon, the settlers raised a flag bearing the slogan, "Come and take it," and fired the cannon at the Mexican troops, who withdrew. The Battle of Gonzales, as this skirmish was called, was more symbolic than militarily significant, but it marked the crossing of a threshold. After Gonzales, both sides began mobilizing for what both sides recognized would be a serious military conflict. The Texian forces that would ultimately find themselves besieged in the Alamo were not a regular army. They were a militia, a ragtag collection of volunteers, adventurers, recent immigrants, and local settlers who shared a commitment to Texian independence, but who varied enormously in their military experience, their motivations, and their understanding of the strategic situation they were entering. Understanding who these men were and what brought them to the Alamo is essential to understanding the battle itself and the mythology that grew up around it. The Texian army of 1835 and early 1836 was essentially two armies with overlapping personnel and competing command structures. The regular army of the Provisional Government of Texas was a paper institution in the fall of 1835 with few trained soldiers and inadequate supplies. The fighting force that actually existed was a volunteer militia that operated according to the democratic principles of frontier military tradition, meaning that soldiers elected their own officers, debated tactical decisions collectively, and felt entirely free to simply go home when they disagreed with their commanders or when their enlistments expired. This democratic military culture was both a strength and a profound weakness. It generated fierce individual commitment and maintained the political buy-in of citizen soldiers, but it made sustained, coordinated military operations enormously difficult. The fall of 1835 saw a series of successful Texian military operations that drove Mexican forces out of most of Texas. The siege and capture of San Antonio de Bexar in December 1835 was the culminating achievement of this first phase of the war, and it was accomplished in large part through the grit and determination of a group of volunteers under the command of Ben Milam. The Battle for San Antonio, which involved intense street-by-street and house-by-house fighting through the town, was one of the hardest fought engagements of the entire Texas Revolution and resulted in significant casualties on both sides. When it was over, the Mexican commander, General Martín Perfecto de Cos, who happened to be Santa Anna's brother-in-law, surrendered the town and agreed to withdraw his forces south of the Rio Grande. Cos also paroled the Texian prisoners and agreed to withdraw his forces south of the Rio Grande. The capture of San Antonio was a significant military and psychological victory for the Texian cause, but it also created problems that would directly contribute to the disaster at the Alamo. The victory seemed to suggest that the war was essentially over, that Mexican forces had been driven from Texas, and that the provisional government could now focus on organizing the new Republic of Texas and debating its political future. Many of the volunteers who had fought in the fall campaign concluded that their service was done and went home, returning to their farms and families and leaving the Texian military forces dangerously depleted at exactly the moment when Santa Anna was organizing a massive counteroffensive. The provisional government of Texas during this period was in a state of near paralysis, racked by factional disputes and personal rivalries that prevented it from making coherent decisions about military strategy, supply, or command. The conflict between Governor Henry Smith, who favored immediate and complete independence, and the General Council, which was more cautious and which controlled much of the provisional government's administrative apparatus, repeatedly prevented the effective organization and supply of the Texian military. Both the governor and the council were issuing orders to the military. The orders frequently contradicted each other, and the military commanders were left to improvise in a situation where improvisation was extremely dangerous. It was in this context of political dysfunction, military understrength, and strategic confusion that the decisions were made that would lead directly to the Alamo disaster. The question of what to do with the Alamo, with the town of San Antonio, and with the small garrison that remained there after the fall campaign's volunteers had gone home, was one of the central strategic problems facing the Texian leadership in late 1835 and early 1836. And the way this problem was handled, or rather mishandled, reveals a great deal about the nature of the Texas Revolution and about the human factors that shaped the Alamo's fate. The men who were present at the Alamo when Santa Anna's army arrived in February 1836 had come there by very different paths and for very different reasons. To reduce them to the heroic archetypes of the popular mythology is to do them a disservice and to miss the genuine complexity and humanity of their actual stories. They were real people, products of their time and place, with real motivations, real flaws, real fears, and real courage. Understanding who they actually were is one of the most important ways that honest historical inquiry can honor their sacrifice. William Barrett Travis was 26 years old when he died at the Alamo, a fact that tends to surprise people who have absorbed the popular image of him as a mature and commanding military leader. He was born in South Carolina in 1809, the son of a farmer, and had trained as a lawyer in Alabama before moving to Texas in 1831, leaving behind a troubled marriage and, possibly, a man he had killed in a personal dispute. In Texas, he had established himself as a lawyer and local political figure, had been involved in several confrontations with Mexican authorities, and had gradually become one of the more radical voices for Texian independence. He was ambitious, passionate, and deeply invested in his own reputation as a man of courage and principle. His famous letter from the Alamo to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world is a remarkable document, not primarily because of its rhetorical power, though it has plenty of that, but because of what it reveals about Travis as a man. His awareness of the hopelessness of his situation, his determination to make that hopelessness of his situation, his determination to make that hopelessness mean something, and his need to be remembered as a man who had not flinched. Travis arrived at the Alamo in January 1836 with a small force of cavalry, having been ordered there by Governor Smith after the provisional government's dysfunction had made coordinated military planning essentially impossible. He was deeply unhappy with his assignment from the beginning. He recognized that the Alamo's defenses were inadequate, that his force was too small to hold it against a serious attack, and that the expected reinforcements were not materializing. his letters from the Alamo, sent throughout the siege, are a remarkable record of a man who understood his situation with clarity and who chose to remain in it anyway, partly out of genuine commitment to the Texian cause, and partly because retreat or surrender would have destroyed the reputation he had spent years building. James Bowie arrived at the Alamo around the same time as Travis, carrying orders from the military commander Sam Houston to blow up the fortifications and withdraw the garrison. This is a crucial fact that the popular mythology almost completely ignores. Sam Houston, the most senior Texian military commander, had initially decided that the Alamo was indefensible and should be abandoned. He sent Bowie to carry out the demolition and withdrawal. But Bowie arrived, surveyed the situation, consulted with local leaders, including the Tejano leaders of San Antonio, became convinced that the Alamo could and should be defended, and sent Houston a letter explaining why he had decided not to follow his orders. This decision, made by Bowie in defiance of his commander's explicit instructions, was one of the most consequential individual decisions in American military history. James Bowie himself is one of the most mythologized figures of the entire Alamo story, a man whose legend had largely displaced his actual biography even before his death. He was famous primarily for the large knife that bore his name, for his reputation as a fearless fighter, for his successful land speculation in Louisiana and Texas, and for his marriage into the prominent Veramendi family of San Antonio, which had given him connections to the Tejano elite and a genuine stake in the future of Texas. He was also a man with a troubled past. His land speculation schemes had involved fraud. His personal life had been marked by violence and tragedy, and his wife and children had died in a cholera epidemic in 1833. Leaving him a grieving and somewhat unmoored figure who threw himself into the Texas political cause with a passion that had nothing to do with rational calculation of his personal interests. Bowie had arrived at the Alamo already ill with what contemporaries described as a peculiar disease, possibly typhoid or pneumonia, and his health deteriorated rapidly during the siege. By the time of the final assault, he was bedridden and unable to command, and the accounts of his death vary so widely that historians have been unable to establish with any confidence exactly how he died. The popular image of Bowie fighting from his sickbed, firing his pistols and wielding his famous knife until he was overwhelmed by Mexican soldiers comes primarily from dramatic accounts that were compiled years after the battle from sources of dubious reliability. The truth of his final moments, like so much about the Alamo, is lost in the fog of battle and the smoke of subsequent mythology. David Crockett is probably the most famous of the Alamo's defenders, and certainly the one whose popular image has most thoroughly displaced historical reality. The Davy Crockett of popular culture, whether the coonskin-capped frontiersman of the 1950s Disney television series or the buckskin-clad hero of countless novels and films, bears only a passing resemblance to the actual David Crockett who arrived at the Alamo in February 1836. The real Crockett was a 50-year-old former congressman from Tennessee, a skilled hunter and woodsman who had built a political career on his frontier image, but who was also a sophisticated politician, a published author, and a man who had just suffered a significant political defeat. He had lost his congressional seat in 1835 and had left Tennessee in something of a funk, declaring publicly that Tennesseans could go to hell and that he was going to Texas. Crockett arrived at the Alamo as part of a group of Tennessee volunteers, men who had come to Texas partly out of genuine sympathy for the Texian cause, partly out of adventurism, and partly out of the economic opportunities that a successful revolution might create. He was not a commander or an officer at the Alamo. He was a volunteer private, albeit one whose celebrity gave him significant informal influence. His death at the Alamo has become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire story, because there is significant historical evidence that Crockett did not die fighting, but was captured during or after the final assault and executed on Santa Anna's orders. This evidence, which comes from multiple Mexican sources, including the diary of José Enrique de la Peña, a Mexican officer who was present at the battle, has been fiercely disputed by those committed to the popular mythology of Crockett's death in combat. We will examine this controversy in detail when we get to the battle itself, because it illustrates better than almost anything else the way that the Alamo has been fought over not just with rifles and cannons, but with history itself. The roughly 185 other men who died at the Alamo include people from an enormous range of backgrounds: Tennessee and Kentucky frontiersmen, South Carolina planters, New Orleans merchants, recent immigrants from England and Ireland, a former sailor from England named John, a gunsmith from Pennsylvania, several men whose origins remain entirely obscure. There were also a small number of African Americans at the Alamo, including Joe, an enslaved man owned by William Barrett Travis, who survived the battle and whose account of events was one of the earliest first-hand testimonies about what happened. Joe's presence at the Alamo and his survival, along with several women and children who were also spared by Santa Anna's forces, complicates the simple narrative of total annihilation that the popular mythology tends to present. The Tejanos at the Alamo represent perhaps the most consistently overlooked group among the defenders, and their inclusion in the garrison challenges the narrative that frames the battle purely as Anglo-Americans fighting for liberty against Mexican tyranny. Juan Seguin, one of the most prominent Tejano leaders in the Alamo story, had actually left the garrison before the final assault, carrying dispatches from Travis to the outside world in a last attempt to summon reinforcements. Had he remained, he would certainly have died with the other defenders, the Tejano soldiers who did remain in the garrison until the end. Men like Gregorio Esparza, whose family sheltered inside the Alamo during the siege, and Toribio Lozoya, and the other Tejano fighters whose names are commemorated on the Alamo cenotaph, were men who had made a genuine choice to side with the Texian cause against the Mexican government, and their decision to do so reflected the genuine divisions within the Tejano community about the future of Texas. One of the least discussed but most significant aspects of the Alamo story is the confused and contested question of who was actually in command of the garrison. This question has significant implications for understanding the decisions that were made during the siege and the nature of the defenders' sacrifice. The simple popular image of Travis as the unambiguous commander, drawing his famous line in the sand and leading his men to their heroic deaths, obscures a much messier reality. When Travis arrived at the Alamo in January 1836, he brought orders appointing him as the commanding officer of the regular cavalry forces stationed there. But Bowie arrived almost simultaneously with a different set of credentials and a different understanding of his authority. The tension between the two men erupted almost immediately, with Bowie challenging Travis's authority and organizing an election among the volunteers who voted to follow Bowie rather than Travis. Travis was furious, and his letters from this period reflect his frustration with what he saw as military indiscipline and disrespect for proper military hierarchy. The two men eventually reached an uneasy compromise, with Travis commanding the regular soldiers and Bowie commanding the volunteers, and both signing official communications jointly. This compromise worked reasonably well as long as both men were healthy and capable of command. But as Bowie's illness progressed and left him bedridden, the question of overall command became increasingly unclear. Travis gradually assumed de facto control, but the ambiguity of the command structure may have contributed to some of the decisions made during the siege, including the decision to fire the cannon in apparent celebration or as a defiant gesture when Santa Anna's forces arrived. A decision that is puzzling from a strictly military standpoint. The famous story of Travis drawing a line in the sand and inviting those who would choose to stay and fight to cross it has become the central image of the Alamo's final hours. Every man stepped across the line, the story goes, with even the bedridden Bowie asking to be carried across on his cot. The problem with this story is that it appears in only one historical source, an account given decades after the battle by Moses Rose, supposedly the one man who refused to cross the line and escaped from the Alamo. Rose's account was not written down until 1873, more than 30 years after the battle, and its authenticity has been disputed by historians ever since. This does not mean that the story is necessarily false. It may reflect something that actually happened, or a story that circulated among survivors, or a reconstruction of what the emotional reality of the garrison's final hours might have been. But it is not established historical fact, and the honest telling of the Alamo story has to acknowledge that one of its most beloved and emotionally powerful moments may be, at least in part, a legend. The Mexican army that arrived outside San Antonio on February 23, 1836 was a formidable force by any objective measure. It comprised somewhere between 1,500 and 1,800 men in its initial contingent, with more troops arriving continuously over the following days, and it was equipped with artillery that could systematically reduce the Alamo's walls if given sufficient time. Santa Anna had driven his army hard to reach San Antonio, pushing them through a late-season cold snap that brought freezing temperatures and even snow to the region, conditions for which many of the soldiers who had marched from the warmer climate of central Mexico were poorly prepared. The speed of the army's approach was itself a significant strategic achievement, because the Texians in San Antonio had expected Santa Anna to delay his campaign until the weather improved in spring, and the army's early arrival caught the garrison partially off guard. The garrison's commander, William Barrett Travis, learned of the Mexican army's approach with almost no warning. On the evening of February 22nd, he attended a party in town celebrating the birthday of George Washington, a detail that perfectly encapsulates the strange mixture of leisure and desperation that characterized the Alamo garrison's final weeks. The next morning, San Antonio's church bell rang an alarm, and within hours, Mexican cavalry was visible approaching the town. Travis and his garrison retreated into the Alamo compound, and the siege began. The first day of the siege was marked by an immediate and significant act of psychological warfare on Santa Anna's part. The Mexican commander ordered that a blood-red flag be raised above San Antonio's church tower. The red flag, in the military traditions of the era, signaled that no quarter would be given, that prisoners would not be taken, and that the garrison could expect no mercy if they surrendered or were captured. The symbolic message was clear. Travis and his men had to choose between escape, surrender, or death. Travis responded to this message by firing one of the Alamo's cannon of the Mexican positions, a gesture that communicated his rejection of Santa Anna's terms. Travis immediately sent out requests for reinforcements, the most famous of which was the letter addressed to the people of Texas and all Americans in the world that he composed on February 24, 1836. This letter, which declared that the garrison would never surrender or retreat, which promised victory or death, and which implored anyone who would listen to send men, provisions, ammunition, and speedy relief, is one of the most rhetorically powerful documents in American history. It was also, as Travis well knew when he wrote it, very likely to have no practical effect. The Texian provisional government was paralyzed by its internal divisions. The nearest organized Texian military forces were not in a position to reach San Antonio in time, and the distances involved in frontier Texas made rapid military movement extremely difficult. The decision not to abandon the Alamo before the siege began is one that has puzzled military historians ever since. The garrison had some warning of the Mexican army's approach, perhaps not enough to escape with all of their artillery and supplies, but potentially enough to withdraw at least most of their men before the investment was complete. Santa Anna's cavalry was not yet surrounding the compound when the first reports of the Mexican advance arrived, and a determined effort to withdraw might have preserved the garrison to fight again elsewhere. Why did they stay? The answers are multiple and interconnected. Travis and the other commanders had convinced themselves that reinforcements would arrive in sufficient numbers to enable them to hold the Alamo, a belief that was probably not entirely irrational given the representations that had been made to them by the provisional government and by Sam Houston. The Alamo's commanders also genuinely believed, or at least hoped, that the fortification could be held against the expected assault, particularly if they could hold out long enough for help to arrive. There was also the question of the symbolism of retreat. Abandoning San Antonio, which had been captured from the Mexican army only 2 months earlier at significant cost, would have been a serious blow to Texian morale and to the revolution's credibility. And there was undeniably the individual pride and reputation of the men involved, particularly Travis, for whom retreat would have been not merely a military decision, but a personal humiliation. The siege of the Alamo lasted 13 days, from February 23rd to March 6, 1836. These 13 days have been compressed in popular memory into a single sustained drama of heroic resistance, but the reality was considerably more complex, a mixture of tense military standoff, desperate diplomatic maneuvering, sporadic artillery bombardment, and the agonizing daily erosion of the garrison's hope that reinforcements would arrive before Santa Anna decided to assault. The physical conditions inside the Alamo during the siege were genuinely harsh. The garrison of roughly 180 to 200 men, the exact number is uncertain because no complete muster roll survives, occupied a compound that covered roughly 3 acres, with defensive walls that stretched for hundreds of feet and that were in varying states of repair. James Clinton Neal, the garrison's original commander before Travis and Bowie arrived, had done his best to prepare the Alamo's defenses before he left on a family emergency in late January, mounting cannon on the walls and earthworks and reinforcing the weakest sections. But the walls were in many places only a few feet thick. They were not designed for defense against the kind of artillery that Santa Anna's army possessed, and the garrison simply did not have enough men to adequately defend the entire perimeter. The women and children who were present inside the Alamo during the siege are another group whose experience is largely absent from the popular mythology. Susanna Dickinson, the wife of Captain Almarin Dickinson, was inside the Alamo with her infant daughter Angelina throughout the siege. She would become one of the primary sources of information about the battle because she was one of the survivors Santa Anna chose to release after the assault, using her as a messenger to carry news of the Alamo's fall to the Texian forces elsewhere. Andrea Castañón Ramirez, known as Madame Candelaria, claimed to have been inside the Alamo nursing the sick Bowie, though historians have questioned various aspects of her account. Several other women, mostly the wives and family members of Tejano defenders, were also present in the compound. Their experiences of the siege and assault, their terror, their grief, and in some cases their remarkable survival, are part of the Alamo story that deserves much more attention than it typically receives. The arrival of reinforcements during the siege was one of the most agonizing and ultimately disappointing aspects of the 13-day ordeal. Juan Seguin and a few other couriers managed to slip through the Mexican lines and carry Travis's desperate appeals for help to the outside world. The response was deeply inadequate. On March 1st, a group of 32 men from Gonzales managed to slip through the Mexican lines and enter the Alamo, the only reinforcement the garrison would receive during the entire siege. These men, who had traveled through the darkness to answer Travis's call for help, arrived knowing they were almost certainly entering a death trap. Their decision to go in anyways one of the most genuinely heroic choices of the entire Alamo story, and it is a choice that tends to be underemphasized in popular accounts that focus primarily on the famous names already inside the garrison. The 32 men from Gonzales, largely local settlers with farms, families, and communities in Texas, men who had everything to lose and who knew it, represent something important about the human reality of the Alamo that the mythology of famous heroes sometimes obscures. They were not legendary figures when they made the decision to ride to San Antonio. They were ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances, and their choice to prioritize their comrades' call for help over their own survival is a form of courage that deserves recognition precisely because it was not performed on a stage of celebrity or historical reputation, but in the darkness and uncertainty of a frontier night. The artillery bombardment that Santa Anna's forces maintained throughout the siege was more psychologically than physically destructive during most of its duration. Santa Anna's artillery was not of sufficient caliber to quickly reduce the Alamo's thick stone walls, and his initial bombardment caused relatively limited structural damage, though it kept the garrison in a constant state of tension and interfered with sleep and rest. As the siege progressed, Mexican engineers moved the artillery closer to the walls and the bombardment became more intense and more damaging. By the final days of the siege, the walls had been significantly damaged in several places and the defenders were exhausted from days of insufficient sleep and constant tension. The night before the final assault, Santa Anna ordered his artillery to stop firing, a cessation that allowed the exhausted garrison to finally get some sleep. Historians have debated whether this was intentional on Santa Anna's part, whether he deliberately allowed the garrison to sleep so that they would be less alert when his forces attacked in the pre-dawn hours of March 6th. What is clear is that the cessation of bombardment was followed almost immediately by the assault, and that the garrison was caught in various degrees of alertness when the Mexican forces finally came over the walls. While the guns were firing at the Alamo, a different kind of war was being fought in the political and diplomatic arenas, and understanding this parallel conflict is essential to understanding why the Alamo's fall had the enormous consequences that it did. The 13 days of the Alamo siege coincided almost exactly with the period during which Texas's political leaders were meeting at Washington on the Brazos to draft the Texas Declaration of Independence and to organize the provisional government into a functioning state. These two events, the military catastrophe at the Alamo and the political birth of the Republic of Texas, were happening simultaneously, and they shaped each other in profound ways. The Texas Declaration of Independence was formally adopted on March 2, 1836, 4 days before the Alamo fell. The men who signed it knew that a Mexican army was besieging the Alamo. They knew that the garrison was in desperate need of reinforcements and that the provisional government had so far been unable to provide them. They continued with their deliberations anyway, partly because creating the political infrastructure of the new republic was genuinely important to the long-term success of the revolution, and partly because there was not much they could practically do about the Alamo situation, regardless of where they were located. Sam Houston, who had been given command of the Texian army with instructions to create an actual army from the disorganized volunteers available, also attended the convention before heading off to organize his forces. The political deliberations at Washington on the Brazos were marked by the same factional divisions and personal rivalries that had paralyzed the provisional government throughout the revolutionary period. There were deep disagreements about the nature of the new republic, about its relationship with slavery, about its relationship with the United States, and about the best military strategy for fighting the war. David G. Burnett was elected as the provisional president of the new republic, and ad interim Secretary of State Samuel P. Carson drafted the declaration's more careful diplomatic formulations. But beneath the formal proceedings ran currents of desperation and urgency, because everyone knew that Santa Anna's army was advancing and that the new republic's survival was by no means assured. The question of whether the United States would intervene in the Texas Revolution was one of the central diplomatic questions of the period. American public opinion was strongly sympathetic to the Texian cause, and American volunteers, supplies, and private financial support flowed into Texas throughout the Revolutionary period. But the official position of the United States government under President Andrew Jackson was one of neutrality. Jackson, whatever his personal sympathies, recognized that supporting the Texas Revolution would create enormous diplomatic complications with Mexico, would reopen the painful political questions about the expansion of slavery into new territories, and would antagonize the significant portion of the American public that had moral objections to slavery and saw the Texas Revolution primarily as a slaveholders' project. Jackson's neutrality was not as pure in practice as it was in theory. American volunteers crossed the border into Texas with relatively little interference from American authorities. American banks provided credit to Texian agents purchasing supplies, and Jackson's personal communications with Sam Houston and other Texian leaders suggest that his sympathy for the Texian cause was genuine, even if he could not express it in official policy. The eventual American recognition of the Republic of Texas, which came on Jackson's last full day in office in March 1837, can be seen as the belated official acknowledgement of support that had been flowing more informally throughout the Revolutionary period. The assault on the Alamo began in the pre-dawn darkness of March 6, 1836. Santa Anna had been planning the assault for several days, resisting the advice of some of his generals who argued that the most effective strategy was simply to wait for the garrison to run out of food and water, which would have forced a surrender without the casualties that a direct assault would inevitably produce. Santa Anna rejected this counsel for reasons that historians have debated ever since: impatience, a desire to send a political message about the consequences of rebellion, contempt for his opponents, or military pride that would not accept the slow siege strategy as sufficiently dramatic. His decision to attack directly, rather than waiting out the garrison, cost his army heavily in casualties and is generally regarded by military historians as a strategic mistake. The assault force comprised somewhere between 1,400 and 1,800 soldiers, divided into 4 columns that would attack simultaneously from different directions, with a cavalry force positioned to intercept anyone who attempted to escape. The plan was for the columns to approach the walls in silence and darkness, place ladders against the walls, and scale them before the defenders had time to organize an effective resistance. Santa Anna placed himself with a reserve force that would be committed if the assault began to fail, though he did not personally participate in the fighting. The garrison was in various states of alertness when the assault began. The sentries heard the approaching Mexican columns and raised the alarm, and the defenders rushed to their positions on the walls. Travis himself was reportedly among the first to the walls, calling out to his men to come to the defense of the garrison. His famous shout, "The Mexicans are upon us, give 'em hell," is one of those moments that sounds like legend, but is actually relatively well attested in the accounts of survivors. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. The initial assault on the walls was actually repulsed in several places. The defenders' musket fire and cannon fire from the walls killed and wounded significant numbers of the attacking Mexican soldiers, and the columns that first reached the walls were thrown back. But the weight of numbers and the pressure of subsequent waves of attackers eventually told. Mexican soldiers reached the top of the walls in multiple places, and once they were inside the compound, the nature of the fighting changed dramatically. The Alamo's interior was not a single open space, but a complex of rooms, courtyards, barracks buildings, and the chapel. And the fighting that followed the breaching of the walls was intense, close range, and brutal on both sides. The garrison fought with desperate ferocity. When their muskets were empty and there was no time to reload, they used them as clubs. The fighting in the barracks rooms was hand to hand and room by room. Mexican soldiers forced their way through barricaded doors and fought their way through narrow corridors against men who had nowhere to retreat and nothing to lose. Santa Anna's soldiers, many of whom were conscripts from poor indigenous communities in central Mexico who had been marched hundreds of miles and were fighting in the pre-dawn cold with the memory of their comrades falling around them, fought with equal desperation and ferocity. The Chapel of the Alamo, which is the iconic building that appears in almost every image of the Alamo and which houses the modern museum and shrine, served as the last refuge of the garrison's final defenders. The building's thick stone walls provided the best protection available, and as the fighting in the compound's other areas went increasingly against the defenders, the survivors fell back toward the chapel. It was here that the most intense and emotionally significant fighting of the final assault took place. Susanna Dickinson, sheltering in one of the chapel's rooms with her infant daughter, described hearing the sounds of the assault with terrifying clarity. She heard the Mexican bugles sounding the charge, heard the screams of wounded and dying men, and at one point saw a defender she knew rush past her with fatal wounds. Her account, along with those of other survivors, including Joe, Travis's enslaved manservant, provides the most direct testimony we have about what the final assault was actually like from the perspective of those inside the walls. Joe's account of the battle is particularly significant, both because he was one of the few eyewitnesses who survived and because his experience illuminates the role of African Americans in the Alamo story, a role that the traditional mythology almost entirely erases. Joe was one of the most direct witnesses to Travis's death, reporting that Travis was shot early in the assault while firing from the walls. The accounts of how Travis died are relatively consistent across multiple sources. He was shot, possibly, by one of the first Mexican soldiers to reach the top of the walls and fell from the parapet. Some accounts suggest that Travis may have been only wounded by the initial shot and was then killed by a bayonet as Mexican soldiers swarmed over the walls. But the basic fact of his early death in the assault is well established. The fighting in and around the chapel was the last sustained resistance of the assault. By the time the fighting reached the chapel, most of the other defenders were already dead, and the survivors were making their last stand in the building's rooms and courtyard. The chapel's roof was already a ruin, open to the sky, and the defenders were sheltering among the rubble and debris that had accumulated since the building's collapse decades earlier. The final fighting in the chapel was perhaps the most brutal of all. Close-range gunfire in the confined spaces, bayonets and knives, when guns were empty, bodies falling among the stone rubble of what had once been a house of worship. No single moment in the entire Alamo story has generated more controversy, more passionate debate, and more insight into the relationship between history and mythology than the question of how David Crockett died. The popular mythology holds that Crockett died fighting, his rifle swinging as a club when his ammunition was exhausted, surrounded by the bodies of his enemies, going down in a blaze of frontier heroism. This is the version that generations of Americans grew up with. The version celebrated in films and novels and the famous Disney television series. The version that has become almost inseparable from the American cultural identity that the Alamo represents. The problem is that there is significant historical evidence that Crockett was actually captured during or after the assault and subsequently executed on Santa Anna's orders. This evidence comes from multiple sources, the most significant of which is the diary of José Enrique de la Peña, a Mexican officer who was present at the battle. De la Peña's diary, which was apparently not widely known outside Mexico until a portion of it was published in a Mexican newspaper in the 1950s, and which was not translated into English and published in the United States until 1975, contains a description of several prisoners being brought before Santa Anna after the main fighting had ended. De la Peña describes Santa Anna ordering the execution of these prisoners and describes one of them, who he identifies as Crockett, or who matches Crockett's description, being killed in this group execution. The publication of the De la Peña diary in English in 1975 generated enormous controversy that has not abated to this day. Some historians accept de la Peña's account as essentially reliable, noting that it is corroborated in its basic outline by several other Mexican sources that describe prisoners being executed after the battle. Others have challenged the authenticity of the diary itself, arguing that it was forged or heavily embellished, and have questioned the reliability of de la Peña's account of events he may not have personally witnessed. The controversy has been further complicated by the discovery that the physical manuscript of the diary has a complex and somewhat murky provenance, and by the fact that the question of Crockett's death has become so politically and culturally charged that it is difficult for many participants in the debate to engage with it purely on the merits of the historical evidence. What is the honest historical assessment of this question? The preponderance of the evidence, when evaluated as objectively as possible, suggests that Crockett was probably captured and executed, rather than killed fighting. The multiple Mexican sources that describe prisoners being executed. The absence of any Mexican sources that describe Crockett dying in combat. And the general pattern of Santa Anna's behavior in the campaign, including his order to execute the prisoners taken at Goliad shortly afterward, all point in this direction. De la Peña's diary, whatever questions remain about the details of its provenance, appears to be a genuine document from the period, and its basic account of prisoner executions is corroborated by other sources. But here is the thing that the controversy often obscures. The manner of Crockett's death does not diminish his contribution to the Alamo or the significance of his sacrifice. A man who chose to remain in a besieged fortress knowing that relief was unlikely and death was probable, a man who fought through a brutal military assault and then faced execution with whatever composure or courage or terror he could muster, is not a lesser hero than a man who died with his rifle swinging. The mythology of Crockett dying fighting is not about honoring his actual sacrifice, it is about creating a particular kind of cultural symbol. And the desperate resistance to acknowledging the evidence of his capture and execution says more about our need for that symbol than it does about Crockett himself. The controversy over Crockett's death also reveals something important about how myths work and why they are so resistant to revision. The Alamo mythology serves significant cultural and political functions in American life. It provides a founding narrative for Texas. It articulates certain values of individual courage and collective sacrifice. It connects contemporary Americans to a heroic past. Challenging any element of this mythology, even on the basis of solid historical evidence, threatens the entire symbolic structure that the mythology supports. This is why the question of Crockett's death generates such passionate responses. It is not really about David Crockett at all. It is about what the Alamo means and what we need it to mean. When the fighting inside the Alamo compound was essentially over, there was still the matter of the non-combatants who had survived. Susanna Dickinson and her daughter, several other women and children, Joe, and a few other individuals were identified as non-combatants and brought before Santa Anna. The Mexican general, despite having ordered the blood-red flag of no quarter and having given explicit orders that no prisoners were to be taken, chose to spare these survivors, an act that various historians have interpreted as a calculated political decision, a moment of humanity in the midst of slaughter, or both. Santa Anna released Susanna Dickinson and the other survivors with a message for the Texian forces. This is what happens to those who rebel against Mexico. He sent them eastward toward the Texian lines, apparently calculating that their eyewitness accounts of the Alamo's fall would demoralize the Texian population and perhaps end the resistance without further fighting. This calculation proved to be precisely wrong. The news of the Alamo's fall, and particularly the stories of the massacre that accompanied it, did not demoralize the Texian population. It enraged them, and the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," became one of the most powerful military slogans in American history. The bodies of the Alamo's defenders were not given a proper burial. Santa Anna ordered them to be burned, and funeral pyres were constructed in which the bodies of the garrison were cremated. The exact location of these pyres has been disputed by historians and has become the subject of considerable controversy in San Antonio in recent decades, with various sites being proposed as the location of the defenders' remains. Some attempts have been made to locate and identify the remains through archaeological investigation, with mixed results. The question of what happened to the defenders' bodies after the battle and where they ultimately rest remains one of the more poignant, unsettled questions of the Alamo story. The Mexican casualties at the Alamo were significant, though the exact numbers have been disputed as vigorously as almost every other aspect of the battle. Santa Anna's official report claimed relatively modest casualties, as was common for commanders reporting difficult battles to their superiors. Other sources, including Mexican officers' accounts and Texian estimates based on what survivors reported, suggest much higher casualties. Modern historians generally estimate that Santa Anna's forces suffered somewhere between 400 and 600 casualties at the Alamo, including killed and wounded, which represented a significant proportion of the assault force and which Santa Anna himself reportedly acknowledged was an unacceptably high cost for what was strategically a minor objective. One Mexican officer allegedly said that a few more such victories would destroy the army, echoing the famous Pyrrhic victory formulation, though this quote may be apocryphal. The fall of the Alamo on March 6, 1836 was, by any objective military measure, a significant defeat for the Texian cause. The garrison was destroyed, the fortification was in Mexican hands, and Santa Anna's army was free to continue its advance into the heart of Texas. The news of the Alamo's fall, spreading eastward through Texas with the refugees who were fleeing the advancing Mexican army, created a panic known as the Runaway Scrape, in which thousands of Anglo-American settlers abandoned their homes and fled toward the American border. And then, just 6 weeks later, everything changed. The Battle of San Jacinto, fought on April 21, 1836, lasted approximately 18 minutes. In those 18 minutes, Sam Houston's Texian army, screaming, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad," as they charged, shattered Santa Anna's forces in one of the most decisive military victories in North American history. They caught the Mexican army during its afternoon rest period, when many soldiers were sleeping and Santa Anna himself was apparently engaged in other activities. Some accounts suggest he was with a woman, though this detail, like much about San Jacinto, has been embellished over time and swept through the camp with a ferocity that left hundreds of Mexican soldiers dead and the remainder fleeing in panic. Santa Anna himself was captured the following day, dressed in a private soldier's uniform in an apparent attempt to escape, and recognized when the Mexican prisoners saluted him. The transformation of the Alamo from military disaster to inspirational myth began almost immediately after San Jacinto. The battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," had served to focus the rage and grief of the Texian soldiers into a military force that could overcome Santa Anna's army. The story of the Alamo's defenders, their 13 days of resistance against impossible odds, Their refusal to surrender or retreat, their deaths at the hands of a force many times their number, became the founding mythology of the new Republic of Texas. Within weeks of San Jacinto, the Alamo's defenders were being celebrated as heroes and martyrs, and the narrative of their sacrifice was being shaped into the form that would endure for nearly 2 centuries. The shaping process was not innocent or purely commemorative. The mythology of the Alamo was constructed with specific political purposes, and understanding those purposes helps us understand how the historical reality of the battle became the cultural symbol that it is today. The mythology emphasized certain aspects of the battle: the heroism of the famous defenders, the brutality of Santa Anna, the justice of the Texian cause, while systematically downplaying or erasing other aspects: the role of slavery, the presence of Tejano defenders, the complexity of the political situation, and the evidence that Crockett may have been captured rather than killed in combat. To understand the full impact of the Spring 1836 military campaign and why "Remember the Alamo" became such a powerful battle cry, it is essential to understand what happened at Goliad, a story that is even less well known to most Americans than the Alamo, but that was arguably more significant in galvanizing Texian and American public opinion against Santa Anna. The Presidio La Bahia at Goliad was the site of another significant Texian garrison during the same period as the Alamo siege. Colonel James Fannin commanded a force of roughly 400 men at Goliad, and his indecision and delayed response to Travis's appeals for reinforcement from the Alamo has been one of the most criticized aspects of Texian military leadership in the Revolutionary period. Fannin made several attempts to move his force toward San Antonio, but each time he encountered difficulties, equipment failures, logistical problems, and apparent uncertainty about the right course of action, and each time he turned back. The garrison at Goliad made no contribution to the defense of the Alamo. After the Alamo fell, Fannin finally received orders from Sam Houston to withdraw his forces eastward, but his retreat was delayed by various factors, and on March 19, 1836, his force was caught by a Mexican army under General J. de Urrea in the open grassland near the Coleto Creek. After a day of fighting in which Fannin's men suffered significant casualties, the Texians surrendered in exchange for what they understood to be a guarantee of treatment as prisoners of war. What happened next shocked both Texas and the United States. Santa Anna, receiving news of Fannin's surrender, ordered that the prisoners be executed in accordance with a Mexican law that mandated death for foreigners who took up arms against Mexico. On March 27, 1836, Palm Sunday, the prisoners at Goliad were marched out of the fort in 3 groups, reportedly told they were being marched to the coast for transportation to New Orleans, and then shot. Roughly 340 men were killed in what became known as the Goliad Massacre. A few dozen managed to escape in the confusion, and some were sheltered by Mexican families in the area who were horrified by what was happening. But the great majority of Fannin's command was executed in cold blood. The Goliad Massacre generated enormous outrage in both Texas and the United States, more than even the fall of the Alamo, because the men at Goliad had surrendered and had been given assurances of treatment as prisoners of war. Their execution was a violation of the laws of war as understood at the time, and it turned international and American public opinion even more firmly against Santa Anna and the Mexican government. The combination of the Alamo and Goliad, of heroes who died fighting and prisoners who were executed in cold blood, gave the Texian cause a moral clarity and an emotional power that transformed it in American public consciousness from a settlers' rebellion into a struggle for liberty against tyranny. The Alamo story has always been primarily told as a story about men, but the women who were present at the Alamo, who survived the battle, and who shaped the memory of the event through their testimony deserve much more attention than they typically receive. Their stories illuminate aspects of the Alamo experience that the masculine mythology tends to obscure, and their role in shaping the historical memory of the battle is significant in ways that are rarely acknowledged. Susanna Dickinson is the most important surviving witness to the Battle of the Alamo. Born Susanna Wilkerson in 1820 in Tennessee, she had married Almon Dickinson in 1829 and followed him to Texas when he went to join the Revolutionary forces. She was only 15 years old when she gave birth to her daughter Angelina, and roughly 16 when she experienced the final assault on the Alamo. Her account of the battle, given in multiple versions over the years following the event, provided much of the detail that shaped the popular understanding of the final assault. But Susanna Dickinson's life after the Alamo was a complex and difficult one that the mythology tends to elide. She was widowed at 16 in one of the most traumatic events in Texas history. She had to rebuild her life from nothing. She remarried multiple times. She struggled with poverty and instability, and she lived with the burden of being the primary survivor witness of an event that had become enormously significant to Texas identity. Susanna Dickinson's testimony changed over the years in significant ways as she repeatedly told and retold her story to different audiences with different agendas. Early accounts focused on the terror and chaos of the assault and her desperate attempts to protect her infant daughter. Later accounts, shaped by the growing mythology of the Alamo and by the expectations of audiences who wanted confirmation of the heroic narrative, incorporated details that were either embellishments or genuine memories that her early traumatized accounts had omitted. Historians have to read her various accounts carefully and skeptically, not because she was a liar, but because all human memory is shaped by subsequent experience and social expectation, and Susanna Dickinson's memory of the Alamo was subject to unusually intense shaping pressures. Ana Salazar Esparza, the wife of Gregorio Esparza who died defending the Alamo, represents the Tejano women of the garrison. Her family's decision to shelter inside the Alamo during the siege reflects the genuine complexity of Tejano loyalties during the revolution. Gregorio Esparza was one of the Tejano defenders who chose to fight with the Texian garrison, and his decision to bring his family into the fortress rather than have them remain in the town reflects the genuine danger that families of anti-Santa Anna fighters faced from the Mexican army's approach. Ana Esparza survived the battle and watched her husband's body being prepared for burial, one of the few defenders whose remains received a proper burial because his brother Francisco, who served in Santa Anna's army, asked and received permission to bury him. The story of Ana Esparza and her family illuminates the often overlooked tragedy of the Texian Revolution for the Tejano community. The Esparza family was divided by the revolution, with Gregorio on one side and Francisco on the other, brothers facing each other across a battle line. This kind of family division was common in the Tejano community, reflecting the genuine uncertainty and complexity of the political choices the revolution forced on people who had lived in Texas for generations and who had family ties, economic interests, and personal loyalties that the revolution's stark demand for loyalty to one side or the other could not easily accommodate. The Tejano experience of the Texas Revolution is one of the most important and consistently neglected aspects of the entire story, and understanding it is essential to any honest account of what really happened at the Alamo and in the broader revolutionary period. The Tejanos, the Mexican origin population that had lived in Texas through the colonial period, were not simply bystanders to the revolution between Anglo-American settlers and the Mexican government. They were active participants with diverse and complex political positions, and their experiences both before and after the revolution tell a story that complicates and enriches the simple narrative of Anglo-American settlers fighting for liberty. Juan Seguin is the most significant Tejano figure in the Alamo story. Born in 1806 into one of San Antonio's most prominent families, Seguin became an early and enthusiastic supporter of the Texian cause. Motivated partly by his commitment to the Federalist political principles that Santa Anna was dismantling, and partly by his integration into Anglo-American political networks through his father Erasmo Seguin's long-standing relationships with Stephen F. Austin and other Anglo-American leaders. Juan Seguin recruited Tejano volunteers for the Texian forces, served as a courier for Travis during the siege, and escaped the Alamo to carry Travis's final appeal for reinforcements, thereby surviving when his comrades inside the garrison did not. Seguin's subsequent career in the Republic of Texas and the state of Texas is a story of gradual marginalization and ultimately exile that illuminates the fate of most Tejanos in post-revolutionary Texas. Initially celebrated as a hero of the revolution, Seguin served in the Texian army, fought at the Battle of San Jacinto, served in the Texas Senate, and became the mayor of San Antonio. But as the Anglo-American population of Texas grew and as anti-Mexican sentiment intensified, Seguin found himself increasingly threatened, accused of disloyalty and collaboration with Mexico by Anglo-American political enemies who found it convenient to question the loyalty of all Mexicans regardless of their revolutionary service. By 1842, the situation had become so dangerous that Seguin fled to Mexico, where he was initially received as a traitor by Mexican authorities, but eventually rehabilitated and allowed to serve in the Mexican military. He spent years in exile from the land and the community that he had helped to create, before ultimately returning to Texas in the 1860s, where he died in 1890. Seguin's trajectory from celebrated hero to exile and back again is not an aberration in the Tejano experience of the Texas Revolution. It is representative of what happened to the Tejano community as a whole. The political program of the Texas Revolution had promised equality and rights to all residents of Texas regardless of ethnic background, and many Tejanos had supported the revolution on the basis of these promises. But the reality of the Republic of Texas and later the American state of Texas was one of systematic dispossession, legal discrimination, and cultural marginalization of the Tejano population. The land grants that Tejano families had held for generations were contested and in many cases lost. The legal and political rights of Tejano citizens were systematically undermined. The culture and language of the Tejano community were treated as foreign and inferior, despite the fact that Tejanos had been in Texas generations before most Anglo-American settlers arrived. This trajectory from participation to marginalization is part of the untold story of the Alamo in the most literal sense. It is a story that was told by the Tejanos themselves, in memoirs and legal testimony and family histories, but it is a story that was not incorporated into the dominant Anglo-American narrative of the Alamo and the Texas Revolution. Restoring this story to its proper place in the historical account is not a matter of political correctness or ideological preference. It is a matter of historical accuracy and of honoring the full complexity of what actually happened. The transformation of the historical Battle of the Alamo into the mythological Alamo, the shrine of Texas liberty, the symbol of American courage and sacrifice, the cultural monument that appears in everything from political speeches to beer advertisements, was not an automatic or natural process. It was made deliberately by specific people with specific agendas, and understanding how it was made is as important as understanding what it displaced. The initial mythologization of the Alamo began almost immediately after San Jacinto. Sam Houston's government had powerful political reasons to celebrate the Alamo's defenders as heroes. The Republic needed a founding mythology that could inspire loyalty and sacrifice, that could justify the revolution to skeptical domestic and international audiences, and that could create a shared identity for a diverse population that had come from many different places and had fought for many different reasons. The story of a small band of heroes dying for liberty against an overwhelming military force of tyrants was perfectly suited to these political needs, and it was promoted energetically by the new republic's political and cultural institutions. The myth-making process also involved significant erasure. The role of slavery in motivating the revolution was downplayed or denied. The complex and divided loyalties of the Tejano community were simplified into a story of loyal Mexicans fighting alongside Anglo-Americans for shared values of liberty. The evidence of Crockett's possible capture and execution was suppressed or ignored in favor of the more heroic story of death in combat. The strategic failures that led to the Alamo disaster, the inadequate political leadership, the failed reinforcements, the defiance of Houston's orders to abandon the fort, were transformed into a narrative of noble sacrifice freely chosen rather than of military bungling that cost brave men their lives unnecessarily. The role of Hollywood in shaping and amplifying the Alamo mythology cannot be overstated. From the silent film era to John Wayne's 1960 epic The Alamo, movies have been the primary medium through which most Americans have encountered the Alamo story, and the version presented in these films has been almost uniformly the mythological one. Heroic defenders, monstrous villains, clear moral stakes, and the comfort of heroes who died for causes worth dying for. John Wayne's film, in particular, is a fascinating cultural artifact because it was made at the height of the Cold War and very explicitly frames the Alamo in Cold War terms, with the defenders representing free world values of individual liberty and dignity against the totalitarian collectivism represented by Santa Anna's army. Wayne, who both directed and starred in the film as Crockett, was making an argument about 1960 as much as about 1836. The Disney television series Davy Crockett, King of the Wild Frontier, which aired in the mid-1950s and which created a Davy Crockett craze that swept American youth culture, was another enormously influential myth-making vehicle. The series' portrayal of Crockett as a quintessential American hero, brave, resourceful, honest, and committed to justice, shaped how millions of American children understood not just Crockett, but the Alamo, and by extension, American history itself. The coonskin cap became the most popular children's toy of 1955, and the Davy Crockett mythology became so deeply embedded in American culture that questioning it, as the historians who published the De La Peña Diary in English would discover 20 years later, felt to many Americans like an attack on something sacred. The physical Alamo, the building in downtown San Antonio, has also been an important site of myth-making in its physical form. The United States Army's addition of the iconic curved top to the facade in 1850 gave the building the distinctive silhouette that it has ever since, transforming a roofless ruin into a recognizable and imposing monument. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas, who administered the Alamo for more than a century from 1905 to 2011, actively promoted a particular version of the Alamo story that emphasized the heroism of the Anglo-American defenders and downplayed or ignored the Tejano and Mexican dimensions of the story. The physical space of the Alamo was organized and interpreted in ways that reinforce this mythological version, with the iconic chapel presented as the Sacred Heart of the shrine, and the broader history of the site as a Spanish mission, as a place of indigenous suffering and labor, as a Mexican military garrison, largely invisible to the millions of visitors who pass through each year. The Daughters of the Republic of Texas, or DRT, are themselves a fascinating and complex institution in the Alamo story. Founded in 1891 as an organization dedicated to honoring the memory of the Texas Revolution and its participants, the DRT became the primary custodians of the Alamo's physical space and historical narrative for more than a century. Their stewardship of the site was motivated by genuine reverence for the Alamo's defenders and genuine commitment to preserving what they understood to be an important historical site. But their understanding of that history was shaped by the racial and cultural assumptions of their time and social class, and the version of the Alamo story they promoted was one that served the interests and identity of Anglo-American Texas at the expense of a more complete and accurate historical account. The DRT's administration of the Alamo was not without its critics, and the tensions surrounding their stewardship became increasingly public in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as Texas's demographics shifted and as the historical scholarship on the Alamo became more sophisticated and more willing to challenge the traditional mythology. The Texas General Land Office took over management of the Alamo from the DRT in 2011, a transition that was contentious and that reflected broader cultural and political conflicts about whose story the Alamo tells and whose interests it serves. The ongoing debates about the Alamo's interpretation and management are not abstract academic disputes. They are connected to living political questions about identity, history, and power in Texas and in America. When the city of San Antonio and the state of Texas began planning a major renovation and reimagining of the Alamo complex in the 2010s, the project immediately became a flashpoint for these deeper conflicts. Proposals to contextualize the Alamo within its full history, including its Indigenous and Spanish colonial periods, its role in the Texas Revolution's connection to slavery, and the Tejano experience of both the revolution and its aftermath, generated fierce opposition from those who saw any complication of the traditional narrative as an attack on Texas heritage and identity. The controversy over the Alamo's historical interpretation is a microcosm of the larger American debate about how we remember and teach our history, a debate that has become increasingly fierce in the 21st century. The arguments for maintaining the traditional mythology, or something close to it, typically emphasize the importance of heroism and sacrifice as inspirational values, the danger of undermining patriotic identity through historical revisionism, and the claim that complications and context distort rather than clarify historical understanding. The arguments for a more complete and honest historical account emphasize the value of truth, the harm done to descendants of marginalized groups by narratives that erase their ancestors' experiences, and the ultimately greater power of a history that can acknowledge complexity without losing its capacity to inspire. Both of these positions contain genuine insights and genuine limitations. The traditional mythology of the Alamo is not simply a lie. The men who died at the Alamo did demonstrate remarkable courage, and their sacrifice did contribute to the creation of the Republic of Texas and ultimately the state of Texas. Travis's letter is a genuinely moving document. The decision of the 32 men from Gonzales to ride into the besieged fortress is genuinely heroic. The physical courage of the garrison in the final assault was real, whatever we think of the political causes for which they were fighting. A historical account that fails to honor these genuine human qualities fails in its own way. But the traditional mythology is also, in crucial ways, false. It erases the role of slavery. It erases the Taino experience. It distorts the political context of the revolution. It suppresses evidence about how some of the defenders died. It transforms a complicated and morally ambiguous historical event into a simple morality tale about liberty and tyranny that serves contemporary political purposes at the expense of historical understanding. A historical account that perpetuates these distortions also fails, and fails in ways that cause ongoing harm to the descendants of those whose stories have been erased. The honest path forward, as with most questions of historical memory, is not to choose between honoring the heroes and telling the full truth, as if these were necessarily in conflict. It is to do the harder work of holding both the genuine heroism and the genuine complexity in the same frame, of honoring real human courage and sacrifice while also acknowledging the political context and moral complications that shaped it. This is harder than mythology, and it is harder than debunking, but it is more honest and ultimately more respectful of the people whose lives and deaths we are trying to understand. The memory of the Alamo has also been a contested site in Mexican and Mexican-American culture, though this dimension of the Alamo's afterlife is almost entirely absent from the Anglo-American version of the story. For Mexican Americans, particularly those in Texas and the Southwest, the Alamo has frequently served as a symbol not of liberty and heroism, but of conquest, dispossession, and the systematic erasure of Mexican heritage and identity from the history of lands that were Mexican before they were American. The battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," which in Anglo-American culture evokes heroism and sacrifice, evokes in Mexican-American culture the memory of a war that resulted in the loss of half of Mexico's territory and the marginalization of the Mexican population that remained in the conquered lands. This divergence in the cultural meaning of the Alamo is not simply a matter of different perspectives on the same event. It reflects fundamentally different histories and fundamentally different relationships to the political and social consequences of the Texas Revolution and the subsequent Mexican-American War. For the descendants of the Anglo-American settlers who fought at the Alamo and at San Jacinto, the revolution created a nation and an identity. For the descendants of the Tejano community, of the Mexican soldiers who fought at the Alamo, and of the broader Mexican population that was affected by the revolution and its aftermath, the same events created a history of loss, displacement, and cultural struggle that continues to shape their relationship to American society and American history. The Chicano civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s explicitly engaged with the Alamo as a symbol of Anglo-American conquest and Mexican-American oppression. Activists held demonstrations at the Alamo, challenged the mythological narrative, and demanded recognition of the Mexican-American experience in the history of Texas and the Southwest. These challenges were not well received by much of Anglo-American Texas at the time. but they were part of a broader cultural and political movement that helped to create the conditions for the more nuanced historical scholarship that has transformed academic understanding of the Alamo in subsequent decades. The scholarship that has emerged from this period of challenge and reassessment is genuinely impressive in its rigor and its willingness to engage with the full complexity of the historical record. Historians like Andrés T. Llarena, Arnaldo de Leon, and Timothy Matavina have illuminated the Tejano experience of the revolution and its aftermath with extraordinary depth and care. Paul Andrew Hutton's work on David Crockett has engaged seriously with the evidence about his death, while honoring his genuine historical significance. William C. Davis has written a comprehensive and scrupulously researched account of the three most famous Alamo defenders. Pekka Melanen's work on the Comanche Empire has fundamentally reframed the political context of the entire period. And historians like Andrew Torgett, whose work on slavery and the Texas Revolution is perhaps the most important recent contribution to our understanding of why the revolution happened, have brought the question of slavery to the center of the analysis where it belongs. This scholarly work has not yet fully penetrated popular culture or public education. The version of the Alamo story that most Americans encounter in school, in films, in museums, and in popular media still bears more resemblance to the mythological version than to the historical one. This gap between scholarly understanding and popular mythology is not unique to the Alamo. It characterizes the public memory of many significant historical events, where the emotional and cultural investments in particular narratives make it extremely difficult for more complex and accurate accounts to displace them. The path toward a more honest public memory of the Alamo runs through education, through the physical space of the Alamo itself, and through the ongoing cultural conversations about history and identity that are reshaping American public life. The renovation and reimagining of the Alamo complex, which has been planned and debated for years, represents an important opportunity to present a more complete version of the site's history to the millions of visitors who come to San Antonio each year. Whether that opportunity will be fully realized depends on political will, on the ability of competing stakeholders to reach agreement, and on the broader cultural climate in which those conversations are taking place. What is clear is that the Alamo will continue to be contested territory in every sense of that phrase. It will continue to be a physical space where competing claims about history and identity are negotiated. It will continue to be a cultural symbol whose meaning is fought over by people with very different stakes in what that meaning is. And it will continue to be a historical event that rewards serious study and honest engagement, precisely because its complexity and ambiguity make it such a rich lens through which to understand the larger forces that shaped American history. The men who died at the Alamo deserve that honest engagement, not the sanitized heroes of the mythology, but the complicated, flawed, courageous, sometimes admirable, sometimes troubling human beings they actually were. Travis, ambitious and passionate and aware of his own mortality. Bowie, brilliant and self-destructive and genuinely brave. Crockett, celebrity and politician and frontier survivor who walked into a death trap with his eyes open. The 32 men from Gonzales who rode towards certain death because their comrades had asked them to. The Tejano fighters who chose a side in a conflict that would ultimately marginalize their entire community. The enslaved man Joe, who survived and whose account shaped the story that the world would hear. The Alamo was not simple. The revolution it was part of was not simple. The history that produced it was not simple, stretching back through the chaos of Mexican independence, through the long suffering of the Spanish mission system, through the extraordinary power of the Comanche Empire, through thousands of years of indigenous civilization on the southern plains. And the consequences that flowed from it were not simple. The Republic of Texas, the Mexican-American War, the expansion of American slavery into new territories, the dispossession of the Tejano community, the eventual transformation of Texas into the complex and contested and endlessly fascinating place it is today. To reduce all of this to remember the Alamo is to honor neither the complexity of the history nor the full humanity of the people who lived it, but to dismiss the cry entirely, to treat the mythology as nothing but propaganda, and the defenders as nothing but symbols of a slaveholders' rebellion, is to commit the opposite error, denying the genuine courage and genuine sacrifice that the mythology, for all its distortions, was trying to honor. The honest truth about the Alamo is harder than the myth and more interesting than the debunking. It is a story about real human beings making real choices in real historical circumstances. Choices shaped by forces they did not fully understand and producing consequences they could not foresee. It is a story about the collision of civilizations, about the violence and dispossession that attended the creation of the United States, about the persistence of the past in the present, and about our enduring human need to make sense of sacrifice and find meaning in suffering. It is a story worth telling in full, all of it, the heroism and the horror, the freedom and the slavery. The Anglo-American settlers and the Tejano community and the Comanche Empire and the indigenous people of the missions, Travis's magnificent letter and Santa Anna's red flag, the 32 men from Gonzales riding toward death and the hundreds of Mexican soldiers who also died on that cold March morning, Susanna Dickinson and her infant daughter, Joe, whose name we barely know and whose testimony shaped the story, Juan Seguin, who survived the Alamo and was destroyed by its aftermath, the Republic of Texas that emerged from the smoke and blood of San Jacinto in April 1836 was from its very first moments of existence a nation in profound and perhaps terminal crisis. The mythology of Texas independence tends to present San Jacinto as a triumphant conclusion, the moment when the heroes of the Alamo were avenged and the dream of Texian liberty was realized. The reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more precarious. The new republic was essentially bankrupt, militarily vulnerable, diplomatically isolated, internally divided, and surrounded by enemies both real and potential. The question was not whether Texas would thrive as an independent nation, but whether it would survive long enough to find an alternative to independence. Sam Houston, who had won the Battle of San Jacinto, and who was elected as the first president of the Republic of Texas in September 1836, understood these vulnerabilities with unusual clarity. Houston was one of the most complex and fascinating figures in the entire Texas story, a man whose personal biography was almost as dramatic as the political history he helped to shape. Born in Virginia in 1793, he had grown up in Tennessee, had ridden in Portsea, had lived for extended periods with the Cherokee Nation, and had been adopted into the tribe, had served under Andrew Jackson in the Creek War, and at the Battle of New Orleans, had been wounded multiple times in combat, had served as a congressman and then governor of Tennessee, had suffered a mysterious personal crisis that ended his first marriage and his political career in Tennessee, had donged to live again among the Cherokee in Arkansas, had drunk heavily and drunk from his Cherokee friends, and had eventually made his turnpad, had drunk heavily in Arkansas, had drunk heavily, would have pointed the dipper fiddle steady, it had its toad heat. See, Houston's relationship with Andrew Jackson was one of the most significant personal connections in the political history of Texas independence. The two men had known each other since the War of 1812, and Jackson had served as something of a mentor and patron to the younger Houston throughout his career. When Houston arrived in Texas, many contemporaries suspected that he was there as Jackson's agent, sent to facilitate the eventual annexation of Texas by the United States. Whether or not this was true in any formal sense, Houston certainly shared Jackson's conviction that Texas should ultimately become part of the United States, and this conviction shaped his political strategy throughout the Republic period. The immediate challenges facing Houston's government were almost overwhelming. The Mexican government had not recognized Texian independence, and there was genuine concern that Santa Anna, despite having signed the treaties of Velasco while a prisoner of the Texians, would repudiate those treaties, reassemble his forces, and launch another invasion. Santa Anna himself encouraged these fears after his return to Mexico, where he initially suffered significant political humiliation for his defeat, but eventually managed to rehabilitate himself politically, partly by downplaying the significance of San Jacinto and partly by exploiting subsequent crises in Mexican politics. The military threat from Mexico was real enough to keep the Texian government in a state of constant anxiety throughout the Republic period. Mexican forces did in fact invade Texas on multiple occasions during the years of the Republic, capturing San Antonio briefly in 1842 in what became known as the Vasquez and Wall raids, and maintaining a persistent threat to Texian settlements along the Rio Grande. These raids demonstrated that Texas could not effectively defend itself against even modest Mexican military incursions, let alone a full-scale invasion. And they reinforced Houston's conviction that Texas needed either American protection or American annexation to be genuinely secure. The financial situation of the Republic was catastrophic from the beginning. Texas had no significant tax base, no established credit, no banking system, and no reliable source of revenue. The provisional government had financed the revolution through loans, land grants, and personal contributions, and the new republic inherited substantial debts without the institutional capacity to service them. The republic issued paper currency, the famous redbacks, which depreciated so rapidly that they became nearly worthless within a few years. Attempts to generate revenue through tariffs and land sales were only partially successful, and the Republic's finances remained in a state of permanent crisis throughout its decade of existence. The land question was central to almost every aspect of Texian politics and economics during the Republic period. Texas's most valuable asset was its enormous territory, and the Republic used land grants both as a form of currency, paying soldiers and creditors in land certificates, and as a tool for attracting new settlers who could develop the territory and increase its taxable population. But the land grant system was also a source of enormous corruption, speculation, and conflict. Land certificate fraud was rampant. The boundaries of grants were imprecise and overlapping. The rights of earlier settlers, including Tejanos who had held land under Spanish and Mexican grants, were frequently ignored or actively violated by Anglo-American speculators who used their political connections and legal sophistication to dispossess earlier landholders. The Tejano experience of the Republic period cannot be separated from this land question. The promises of equality and protection that had been made to Tejanos during the Revolution, in the Texas Declaration of Independence, and in the political rhetoric of revolutionary leaders were systematically broken in the years following San Jacinto. Tejano land grants that had been held for generations were challenged in the courts, where Anglo-American judges and juries were rarely sympathetic to Tejano claimants, or simply seized through force and intimidation by Anglo-American settlers who recognized that the legal and political system would not protect Tejano property rights. The dispossession of the Tejano community was not a gradual or accidental process. It was rapid, systematic, and in many cases deliberate, driven by land hunger, racial contempt, and the political powerlessness of a community that had been demographically overwhelmed by Anglo-American immigration. Juan Seguin's trajectory during the Republic period illustrates this process with painful clarity. Having survived the Alamo siege, fought at San Jacinto, and served the new Republic in multiple capacities, Seguin was elected to the Texas Senate and later became the mayor of San Antonio, one of the most prominent political positions held by a Tejano in the Republic period. But his political prominence made him a target. Anglo-American settlers who coveted Tejano land in the San Antonio area found it politically convenient to accuse Seguin of collaborating with Mexico, and the accusations became so threatening, backed by implied and sometimes explicit violence, that Seguin felt he had no choice but to flee to Mexico in 1842. The irony of Seguin's situation was almost unbearable. A man who had risked his life for Texian independence, who had buried the ashes of the Alamo's defenders with military honors, who had served the Republic faithfully for years, was driven from the land he had helped to create by the very Anglo-American settlers whose cause he had championed. In his memoirs written years later, Seguin described his feelings with a controlled bitterness that speaks across the centuries. A victim to the wickedness of a few men whose impostures were favored by their origin and recent domination over the country, I became a foreigner in my native land. The phrase "foreigner in my native land" captures something essential about the Tejano experience of the Texas Revolution and its aftermath that no amount of mythological heroism about the Alamo can obscure. the men and women who had lived in Texas for generations before the Anglo-American colonists arrived, who had built San Antonio and the other settlements, who had fought and died alongside Anglo-American revolutionaries, found themselves after the revolution treated as aliens in a land that their families had inhabited for longer than the United States had existed. Chapter 2. The Comanche Question and the Republic's Impossible Geography. Any honest account of the Republic of Texas must grapple seriously with the Comanche question, because the relationship between the Republic and the Comanche Empire was one of the central political and military challenges of the period, and one that shaped the Republic's development in profound ways. The popular mythology of Texas tends to present the Comanche as a problem that was eventually solved through military force, a narrative of heroic Texas Rangers subduing a savage enemy and opening the frontier to civilization. This narrative is not simply morally problematic. It is historically inaccurate in ways that matter for understanding what actually happened. The Comanche in the 1830s and 1840s were at or near the peak of their power. The introduction of the horse had transformed Comanche society over the preceding century and a half, enabling them to dominate the southern plains through a combination of extraordinary horsemanship, sophisticated military tactics, and a raiding economy that extracted wealth from the settled populations around them. The Comanche raided deep into Mexico, reaching as far south as Durango and Zacatecas, returning with horses, cattle, captives, and trade goods that sustained a prosperous and powerful society. They raided Anglo-American and Tejano settlements in Texas with equal effectiveness, and the Republic of Texas's inability to protect its frontier settlements from Comanche raids was one of the most persistent and damaging failures of the Republic's government. Sam Houston's approach to the Comanche question was significantly more sophisticated than the simple military confrontation that characterized the policies of some of his successors. Houston had lived among native peoples and understood that the Comanche could not be defeated through the military means available to the Republic. He pursued a policy of treaty-making and negotiation, attempting to establish stable borders and trading relationships that would reduce Comanche raiding without the expensive and probably futile military campaigns that his more aggressive political opponents favored. Houston's policy was not simply pragmatic. It was also, by the standards of his time, relatively humane, reflecting his genuine respect for native peoples developed through his years living among the Cherokee. But it was deeply unpopular with the Anglo-American frontier settlers, who wanted military protection, and who resented any policy that appeared to treat the Comanche as legitimate political actors rather than as enemies to be destroyed. This conflict between Houston's accommodationist approach and the frontier settlers' demand for military aggression was one of the defining political tensions of the Republic period. The Council House Fight of March 1840 was the event that most decisively shaped the subsequent relationship between the Republic of Texas and the Comanche. A delegation of Comanche leaders had come to San Antonio to negotiate the release of Anglo-American captives and to discuss peace terms with Texian officials. The Texian government, operating under a policy established by the Mirabeau Lamar administration, which had replaced Houston's first term with a much more aggressive approach to native peoples, decided to take the Comanche delegates hostage as leverage for the return of captives. When the Comanche leaders inside the council house realized what was happening, fighting broke out. 35 Comanche, including most of the peace delegation, were killed along with 12 Texians. Several Comanche leaders managed to escape. The council house fight was a catastrophic diplomatic failure with consequences that reverberated for years. The Comanche response was swift and devastating, a massive raid into the heart of Texas's settled regions, reaching as far as the Gulf Coast town of Linville, which was essentially destroyed, and leaving a trail of death and destruction across hundreds of miles of Texas settlements. The Great Raid of 1840, as it became known, demonstrated both the military power of the Comanche and the inability of the Republic to protect its citizens against determined Comanche attacks. It also made peaceful negotiation between the two sides vastly more difficult, poisoning the diplomatic well for years afterward. Mirabeau Lamar, who served as President of the Republic of Texas from 1838 to 1841, was in almost every respect Houston's opposite as a political leader, and his presidency represents one of the most consequential and in some ways most disastrous periods in the Republic's history. Where Houston was pragmatic and accommodationist, Lamar was idealistic and aggressive. Where Houston favored American annexation as the solution to Texas's problems, Lamar dreamed of an independent Texas empire that would stretch from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. Where Houston sought accommodation with native peoples, Lamar pursued their expulsion from Texas territory with explicit and unashamed determination. Lamar's vision of Texas as a great independent republic was grandiose, expensive, and ultimately delusional. The Santa Fe expedition of 1841, in which Lamar sent a military and commercial expedition westward to assert Texian claims to Santa Fe and to open trade routes to New Mexico, was perhaps the most spectacular failure of his presidency. The expedition was poorly organized, inadequately supplied, and launched into territory that the Comanche controlled and that the Texians had no realistic capacity to defend. The expedition's members suffered terribly from heat, thirst, Comanche attacks, and hostile terrain before surrendering to Mexican forces in New Mexico. The survivors were marched to Mexico City in conditions of considerable brutality, generating diplomatic protests and considerable embarrassment for the Republic. Lamar's policy toward the Cherokee of East Texas was equally aggressive and equally disastrous in human terms, if somewhat more successful in its immediate military objectives. The Cherokee had been living in East Texas for decades, having been pushed westward by Anglo-American settlement in the southeastern United States, and they had maintained generally peaceful relations with the Spanish and later Mexican authorities. Sam Houston, who had lived among the Cherokee and who had personal relationships with Cherokee leaders, had negotiated a treaty with the Texas Cherokee during the Revolutionary period, promising them title to their lands in exchange for their neutrality or support during the Revolution. Lamar repudiated this treaty, arguing that the Cherokee had no legitimate claim to Texas land and that their removal was necessary for the security and development of the Republic. In 1839, Texian forces attacked the Cherokee settlements, killing Chief Bowles, who had been a personal friend of Houston's and who died carrying a sword that Houston had given him as a gift. In a detail that carries an almost unbearable irony, the surviving Cherokee were driven across the Red River into what is now Oklahoma, losing the lands they had occupied for decades and suffering significant casualties in the process. Houston, watching from the sidelines during Lamar's presidency, was horrified by these policies and said so publicly. When he returned to the presidency for his second term in 1841, he attempted to reverse course, pursuing treaty-making with the Comanche and other native peoples and trying to establish a more stable and less expensive frontier policy. But the damage done by the Council House fight and by Lamar's aggressive policies could not be easily undone, and the fundamental tension between the Republic's expansionist ambitions and its military and financial limitations remained unresolved.